In this episode of Reflecting History, I'm doing something a little bit different. I interviewed historian, author, and journalist S.C. Gwynne about his book called Hymns of the Republic. The book is about the last year of the Civil War. And we had a conversation about the Civil War and some of the bigger themes that I see as important to the modern day. This included Lincoln's public and private thoughts on slavery and how this impacts the legacy of the Civil War. We talked about the causes of the war. We talked about the African American experience, particularly on the Union side of things. We discussed medical problems and sort of the medical Civil War, as well as Clara Barton and others who seemed to use the war as a way to dig deep and become something more than they were. We also talked about the brutality of the war, and in particular, the legacy of people like William Sherman and his March to the Sea, and sort of how we should remember the war from a moral perspective on both sides of the conflict. We also talked about the crucial election of 1864 and some of the more modern day parallels. What sorts of things did we see happening during the Civil War time period that can be applied to today, and what types of things might give us comfort from that time period, but also what types of things should make us worried about what we see in the modern day. So with all that being said, S.C. Gwynne is a best-selling author. He's written a number of history books, including Rebel Yell, which is a biography of Stonewall Jackson. His most famous book is probably Empire of the Summer Moon, which is about the Comanche Indians and sort of the American West. And this one is called Hymns of the Republic. SC has won numerous awards for his writing, and he's even been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. All that being said, I hope you enjoy the conversation, and thanks for listening. All right, so I'm joined here by S.C. Gwynne. The book is called Hymns of the Republic. So Sam, thanks for joining me here today. Really appreciate it. Why don't we go ahead and start with, maybe you could just give us a brief sort of background on your career path and how you got to start writing about history.
Okay, well, I started out, I guess, as a journalist. I was a magazine writer for a long time. Editor too, magazine writer and editor for many years. The bulk of that was with Time magazine. A dozen years with Time magazine, and then probably 8 or 9 years with Texas Monthly, a Austin, Texas-based magazine. And so it was out of the world of journalism that I came, and I had, many, many bylines and many, many, articles written before I started to write nonfiction history. The significant history that I started to write was probably around 2004 or 5, in that range somewhere. I was living in Texas, and I knew a little bit about the history, and I just felt like I wanted to do something about that. And so I ended up writing a book about the Comanche Indians, which has a lot to do with Texas history, that came out in 2010, called Empire of the Summer Moon. And what that did was it sold a lot of copies, and I think we're at about 1.5 million now. So the book did well, and it kind of opened this other world for me. I mean, once that book had been out there, I didn't really need to work at a day job anymore, and so I could turn myself to writing history, which I pretty much have done since then. I wrote a biography of Stonewall Jackson. Next, I wrote a kind of a history of a little football history. Next, a little side project, and then the book I have out right now basically is another book about the Civil War called Hymns of the Republic. So I do a little bit of journalism now, but I write a little bit for Outside Magazine and this and that here and there, but I basically write books.
Yeah. So that, they kind of say everybody has a Civil War connection, and it seems like the Civil War is probably the area of U.S. history where the most scholarship is. So was there anything in particular that brought you to the Civil War, and particularly this period you write about, which is, basically the last year or two of the Civil War?
Right. Well, yes, it was. I've always loved the Civil War, and I do think it's a great American subject. If you're a historian, there's really nothing as dramatic, nothing as significant, nothing as meaningful, nothing as broad-reaching as the Civil War. And so I had this bestseller, Empire of the Summer Moon, on my hands, and I was in a moment where I was sort of encouraged, I guess, to try to sort of do what I would like to do, because that was a window that was open, at least momentarily, and maybe that window wasn't opening again. Or wouldn't open again. And so I went to the Civil War, and the subject I chose was Stonewall Jackson. And that's what brought me to the Civil War, because of all the things in the world that I wanted to do. And I thought maybe I could do them, or that subject right then. That's what I wanted to do. So that's what I did. I spent, I don't know, probably 3 years on that book. Really got emotionally and intellectually invested in the Civil War. Much more so than I had been before. And also, I actually, at the end of that project, I actually knew something about the Civil War. It's always nice to actually know something. And so that's how I get to the Civil War. And that book really covered the first 2 years of the war. And, I had to find out what happened and, what happened, So I wrote a book about the last year of the war, who won, what happened to Lincoln, stuff like that, who knew?
Yeah, so I just kind of want to get that out of the way, and maybe we can start talking about the book now. Okay. I figured we'd just kind of go over maybe some of the big themes, at least as I saw them. So I'll start you off with an easy one, which is Lincoln's views on slavery and sort of the historical context around that and the confusion. So at one point in the book, you quote a letter that Lincoln wrote to during this time period. And I'll just quote it here. He says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, then I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." So that's what Lincoln said in that letter. And how do you sort of make sense of a quote like that? Because I feel like, taken out of context, there's just a lot of ways that could go, sort of into the wrong hands, and people kind of misanalyzing that quote and leading to some problems. So how do you kind of view that?
Right. Well, it's one of the most, can you believe how convoluted that quote is? One, it's convoluted. Two, it's the work of genius. Lincoln was a genius with words, and that paragraph is a work of genius. It is so folded back and double hedged, and
right.
I don't know what the word is. It is an incredible, and it reflects how Lincoln himself was sort of dancing through the raindrops of the question of slavery. So let's go back to the beginning of the war. Why did the war happen? The war happened initially because these 11 Confederate states seceded. And there would never have been a war if Lincoln hadn't taken issue with that. But he did. He said, you can't do that. It's not legal. It's not constitutional. You cannot. He never recognized the separate nation. So I'm going to send 75,000 U.S. troops down to bring you back into the Union, basically, to restore the Union. And that was the goal of the war when it started. It would later not be, but right then that was the goal of the war. And Lincoln went to great pains to say that is the goal. That is what we're trying to do. We're trying to restore the Union. We are not trying now to emancipate all the slaves. We are not trying to do anything like that. We are not trying to end slavery. Now, there were some really good political reasons for that. Lincoln himself abhorred slavery. If he could have gotten rid of it, he would have gotten rid of it. But he had this little problem, and I'm joking, little problem. It was a gigantic problem. It was the border states. And by the border states, we mean Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, right? These were slave states that had not seceded. They were part of the North. Lincoln was desperate to keep them from seceding, to keep them in the Union. And his the idea from his point of view anyway, if he had emancipated all the slaves or done something radical about slavery, he might have lost them. It's amazing when you look at what those things were. Not only were those states ways into the South through railways and rivers and roads into the South, but they were also a gigantic. I mean, if you had added the numbers of people in those states to the Confederacy, you would have increased the size of the Confederacy by 60%. If you had added their industrial might to the Confederacy, you would have doubled it. It was not inconsequential. I mean, whichever way these border states went was not inconsequential. So Lincoln had to play this game, and he played the game. And the game was, we're fighting here to restore the Union. Now, he received great pressure. He and other conservative Republicans who were taking this tack, received great pressure. You all can't do that. People like Frederick Douglass saying, this is crazy. You can't, this is not why we're fighting the war. We should be fighting the war because of, to end slavery. Well, Lincoln, after holding out, and there were a couple of Union generals who tried on their own to liberate slaves, and Lincoln slapped them down. But come September of 1862, he was ready to change, and change he did. And he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which changed everything. It changed what the war was about. When it was promulgated in January of 1863, it became the new reason for the war, if you will. It was now a war of black liberation. It was not a war just to restore the Union. And this was a gigantic moment in the war, and it counts for that incredible quote that you just read me.
It just seems to me, sort of the older I get, the more prevalent this idea that the Civil War was not caused by, maybe not caused by slavery, but slavery was not the primary cause, when, clearly anyone who, just looks at the facts can see that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. But I think they'll take a quote like that, where Lincoln is kind of hedging and, not necessarily coming, being forthright with his private opinions in public, and sort of having to do this political dance that you're talking about. But I think you do a great job of sort of breaking down that context where, yes, the start of the war is about slavery. Yes, the reason Lincoln fights is to preserve the Union, at least at first. And that doesn't necessarily make him a hypocrite. That just makes him a realist for trying to figure out how to win the war.
Right. Although he was called very loudly a hypocrite by very, very many people.
Right.
Early in the war. It's interesting, though, this question, because it was a question back then, and it's a question now. What was the war about? That is a question that Americans still can't agree on. And from my point of view, for what it's worth, what the war was about was a 50-year sectional conflict over what we were going to do with these three gigantic chunks of new property that we got. Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession, which gave the whole American Southwest, California, New Mexico, Arizona, everybody, and then the Northern Cession by the British in the Oregon Territory. We had this enormous amount of land that we didn't know what to do with. Was that land going to be free or going to be slave? And that is what the debate since the 1820s raged about. What were we going to do with these territories in Kansas and Nebraska and New Mexico and California and Texas and everywhere else? What were we going to do about it? And that was the sectional conflict. That was what was behind everything. And frankly, to people who say the war wasn't about slavery, I refer them very simply to the Articles of Secession. Go read the Articles of Secession, meaning the account of why the southern states are seceding. Google it. Mississippi and South Carolina, and read that, and then tell me that the war isn't about slavery. They're specific. Now, this isn't an accidental myth. Jefferson Davis was saying this while the war was still going on, that the war isn't about slavery. Later, it became part of a whole tradition of thinking that the war was really about, states' rights and tariffs and things like that, and or about the aggression of the North. But no, just read the Articles of Secession. That will tell you what the South thought was the reason for secession.
Yeah, I mean, you could even throw South Carolina or Georgia, or just look at the Confederate Constitution as well.
Exactly.
Sort of, and yeah, my view of that is kind of just, whatever way you want to look at it, whether it's sectional tensions or economic differences or some of these big flashpoint popular culture events like, Nat Turner or John Brown or Bleeding Kansas, if you just boil down all of those issues to what is at the core of the issue, it's always slavery.
Exactly. No, I agree. Exactly. I agree completely.
So how do you view this idea where, yes, the war could be caused by slavery, but was that necessarily why the average Confederate soldier, joined up? Was it necessarily as a, defense of slavery, or were there other factors leading into sort of the average Joe, getting involved in this conflict?
Right. And that's another good question. And it's another reason why the subject I mean, even though I think the war, I believe what I just said about the causes of the war, it's still not simple, and it's never simple. And the best example, or one of the best examples I can give you of that is, I wrote a biography of Stonewall Jackson a few years ago, and there's a moment when he marches on. He's a physics professor at a little college in Virginia, and at some point, with his cadets, he marches off the hill, down the hill to war, and Jackson is not doing that because he is a fire-eating defender of slavery or a proponent of slavery, or because this is why he thinks there should be a war and people should. This isn't in his mind. He was a Virginian, and his soil was being invaded. And if you had asked those guys who marched off the hill from the Virginia Military Institute that day, they would have given you the same answer. I think they were fighting a northern aggressor who was bringing an army into their territory, particularly their state. I mean, a lot of the allegiances back then were, particularly in the South, I think more so in the South than the North. But the allegiances were to states first, and there is plenty of evidence that there are plenty of people, fire eaters in the South, particularly in the Deep South, who thought from the moment the war started that, they wanted that slavery was the main issue. But for so many of them, and I think for a lot of Virginians, it wasn't.
Right. And
it's just another I mean, right. It's the subject. Nothing is simple in the Civil War, but that's just another thing that isn't simple. So
it kind of circles back to what we were saying earlier, where in a lot of ways it's clear cut, but in a lot of ways there's also this nuance, and maybe that's part of the reason of why so many people are fascinated by the Civil War, because it's a conflict that has a lot of nuance and has a lot of human emotion in it and human figures. One of my old history Civil War professors, he used to say, you can't understand the Civil War unless you understand the emotion of the time period. And to me, that's the job of the historian, to sort of bring that out when you're talking about the modern day, which I think you do a great job of. But yeah, to pivot to something else, I wanted to talk about what you think about the African American experience during the war, particularly for Black soldiers. What was their experience like during this conflict?
It was, talk about nuance. There's so many levels of meaning there too.
Yeah.
One of the most significant things I'm writing about in Hymns of the Republic, I'm writing about the last year of the war. And one of the most significant, if not the single most significant thing, certainly in the Union Army, was the presence of 180,000 Black soldiers. This is 10% of the Union Army was Black. 60% of those were people who had been slaves until very, very recently. And so you suddenly had this massive presence that, in fact, did tip the balance of power in favor of the Union. Everybody says, well, if you look at troop strength, it always looks like it's 2-to-1 Union versus Rebel. But in fact, when you look at the amount of troops that the Union had to logistically deploy along supply lines and guarding camps and garrisoning cities and doing all the stuff that they did, they had far fewer effectives, on the forward lines than it would seem. And so you add 180,000 troops in there, and it really does change things. The Black soldiers' experience was, it was, well, there's two levels of it. One is the level at which they experienced it as Union Army soldiers as soldiers in the Union Army, forgetting for the moment about the rebels. They were treated as second-class citizens. They were often abused. They were paid abysmally. They were often, punished in ways that looked just like slavery. They were, the Northern soldier was absolutely a white supremacist, and in the sense that he believed that white people were superior, clearly, and should have the superior jobs, and should, so black soldiers were given terrible, the latrine duties, all the really bad fatigue duties, and the heavy labor in the hot climates of the South. This is by Union officers. So,
and that stuff resulted in, actual deaths that were not insignificant. I think I remember you writing something about that.
Yeah, no, it was really, and in some cases, it looked just like slavery. In other words, the officers looked just like slave masters. There were obviously, this wasn't a universal story, and was every the black soldiers always had white officers. All the white officers weren't bad. I mean, the bad ones were really bad. They abused them and they robbed them and they did all sorts of things. But that wasn't universally true. There were many good white officers also. But so that was the first level of war. You had these black soldiers had to deal with racism from their own side. Now you flip it over to the Confederates, to when they had to, particularly when they had to fight in battles. They were targeted. They were given no quarter. The stories of, I start my second chapter in the book is about the greatest atrocity of the Civil War, Fort Pillow, which was Confederate soldiers killing black soldiers who had surrendered. So it was a really tough time for these black soldiers, but they really wanted to be in the Army. For them, it was, if you take a slave, for example, who didn't have any rights at all, no right to have money, no right to marry, to travel, no legal or political rights of any kind. Suddenly he's a soldier, he's got a uniform, he's got a paycheck. As Frederick Douglass pointed out, this is somebody he doesn't look like a slave anymore. He looks like a citizen. They really were excited about this. And what you had, all of what I just said before, the targeting and the mistreatment by or the failure by Confederates to give them the rights of normal prisoners of war, or the abuse by the Northern officers, you just think it would have discouraged them from enlistment. It didn't. They just enlisted like crazy, and they were very enthusiastic about what they did. And it was, in spite of all the trouble, it was still, it was, as Frederick Douglass suggested it would be, it was a transformative experience for black people in America.
So sort of the culmination of some of that racism, or just what you sort of described as this white supremacist attitude, happens at this slaughter at Fort Pillow. I think you referenced it in the second chapter of your book.
Right.
But this is you talking about it. I'll just quote a couple sentences here, and then we can talk about it. But you said, quote, "The carnage did not stop on the battlefield. Wounded men in the field hospital were killed, as were sick soldiers in tents inside the fort. Some were burned alive when their tents were set on fire. Later testimony by individual black soldiers suggested a cruelty so wanton that it almost defies belief. Daniel Tyler, a former slave from Mississippi and a private in the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery, was shot at point-blank range after he surrendered. He was shot again by another captor and had his eye jabbed out. He was then buried alive with dead soldiers and dug himself out only with the help of a sympathetic rebel." End quote. So you sort of describe this horrible slaughter of black soldiers in this battle that was already over, and things sort of got out of hand. How do you describe, or how do you ascribe motivations to the aggressors? This is sort of one of the big questions of history, is how do you explain basically how a human could do this to other people? And it seems like this seems to happen over and over again in war after war. But how do you view Fort Pillow and sort of why that happened?
It was the big question at the time. The first question, anyway, is whether whether the reason that the rebel soldiers had done this to the black soldiers was because they had been ordered to by their commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest. That was the first question. Now, a lot of people believe that he had ordered it. But the evidence suggested that he really hadn't ordered it. He had tolerated it and he had let it go, but he never said, go do that. The evidence suggests it was spontaneous. It was spontaneous anger. Remember that a lot of this is in right along the Mississippi River, excuse me, and a lot of these soldiers these black soldiers had recently been slaves from the same area where the rebel soldiers who were fighting them were from. So it was the newly freed slaves literally fighting against their masters. So you had a bit of that. You had Confederate soldiers who were not used to fighting blacks and were not even, that there's this whole idea that they were inferior, they were subhuman, they had these clear ideas, but this idea that someone would be fighting them was completely radical. There had been some taunting from the parapets of the fort by black soldiers of the white soldiers, that was part of it. Of course, taunting went on all over the place, but this happened to be blacks taunting whites, and not that there was much of it or anything other than that contributed to it. But as far as anyone can tell, it was a spontaneous, just anger that against it was like, I guess you would call it a pure racism. It was just flat out pure racism. That's what caused it. They weren't ordered to do it. They just did it. And it was, this kind of moment. This is April of, April of 1864 here. We're in the war's final year. You have all these black soldiers in the Union Army, but most of them haven't fought yet. So this is this kind of new moment when rebel soldiers are now going to start to confront. They had confronted them before, but this was going to be on a much bigger level now. I think the motivation is really, it's just strip it all away. It's just flat racism. I can't come up with any other account.
And I think it's interesting that you look at something that happens like Fort Pillow, and sort of like we mentioned earlier, the media gets a hold of this, and we have this totally different reaction in the northern media, where this is obviously an example of Confederate racism and cruelty, whereas in some places, at least in the southern the Confederate media, this was sort of a example of why blacks shouldn't be allowed to fight and why the white race is superior. And you sort of get these two media machines spinning, and the emotion continues to get stirred up. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that the South took it. Forrest commented about it. He said this wasn't. I said I didn't order this. He said what this was is this is what happens when white soldiers who are superior beings in all ways, but we didn't say that, but his implied, who are superior beings in all ways, fight black soldiers. This is what you're going to get, he said. This idea that, if they're going to throw black soldiers against us, we're just going to have to kill them all because we can, and that's what's going to happen. And in the North, right, as you say, there was a huge congressional inquiry into this. This is a big scandal, and it made Nathan Bedford Forrest the devil incarnate for the rest of the war, on down into eternity in the North. But the message in the North that came through all the media accounts and the cover story in Harper with the black soldiers being bayoneted, surrendering black soldiers, the message was really clear. It was, that Fort Pillow was the single greatest atrocity of the war, and it was proof, of the cruelty and moral degeneracy and racism of the Southern soldier. So two very different lessons were drawn from that.
Right. And just one other point on black soldiers during the war that you talk about in the book, and I think this is something that gets overlooked a lot, and it's that a lot of times historians, authors, people writing or talking about history will paint with a broad brush, and in some ways I've kind of already done that here just in the way I've been asking questions, and sort of just referring to black soldiers or the African American experience. And what you point out is that inside of that category, there's a huge diversity of different types of people from different places. Some were former slaves, some were from the Northeast, some were from the Mid-Atlantic.
Tradesmen from Ohio, you know.
So how do you view that, where you get this sort of diversity within that group?
Well, everybody kind of North and South both just saw, you know, Negroes, as they called them, as Negroes. I mean, there was one category, right? It's just that one size fits all. And if you looked at, say, some of the people in Ben Butler's Army Corps that came south with Grant toward Richmond and Petersburg, that was just amazing. I mean, the absolute. I mean, you had probably half of the people in that particular unit were slaves, former slaves rather, who had been very recently slaves, but from different states. Not all from Virginia. Some of them were from other states in the deeper South. You had all, right as you're saying, all manner of different professions and skilled trades, and waiters and shoemakers, and, you know, skilled tradesmen from various things, tenant farmers from Maryland. You had all shades of the rainbow. I mean, there were blacks that looked very white, blacks with red hair and freckles, blacks who looked very black. I mean, really, and all shades in between. They didn't look alike. They didn't, and there was a big difference, of course, between many of the northern slaves were literate, and I would guess most of the southern slaves were not. And so you had, you know, a little bit of looking down the noses. On the other hand, the slaves from the South often had better music, and the northern black soldiers were not, you know, shy about taking their music back north with them. So it was, really interesting and various, and a variety of people that, you know, I think, right, people tend to see it as the black soldier as a monolithic thing, and he absolutely was not.
Right. So I'd like to shift gears again here. I think we'd be remiss if we talked about the last year of the war and didn't mention Ulysses S. Grant. So you sort of have to do this dance between the top level political and military figures when you're breaking down a conflict like this. But of course, you also want to talk about the experience of the common man, which hopefully we've talked about a little bit, and hopefully we'll get to some more. But I do want to talk about Grant and basically what was his strategy to win the war, and why was he different than some of the Union commanders that came before him?
When Grant came east in March of 1864 to become the first, well, really the third three-star general, the third lieutenant general in American history after Washington and Winfield Scott, but really he was the first one who had during a war, it wasn't an honorary promotion. He was the guy from the West, you know, as we thought of it back then. He was the guy who had won at Shiloh, and had won at Fort Donelson, and had won at Vicksburg, and won at Chattanooga. He wasn't somebody who had the crap beaten out of him by Robert E. Lee, which pretty much described the Union generals like Pope and Hooker and Burnside and so forth, and McClellan, who had been humiliated and then removed from their jobs. So Grant comes in, and Grant is this guy. He's a relentless, straight ahead fighter. He doesn't back down, and he isn't timid, and he isn't looking for excuses to not fight, which describes many of the earlier Union generals. So Grant arrives and into this last year, and there's this great moment of anticipation in the North, right? The savior is here. This is the guy who's going to save the Union. We're tired of these defeats. I mean, these big defeats at battles of First and Second Bull Run and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Cedar Mountain and over and over again. Gettysburg was not a defeat, but it wasn't exactly a great victory either. And so here he is now. And a lot of the people in the North in the South too, they saw this as kind of single combat in a sense. The two most brilliant generals of the war were finally going to meet. And that is what they did. In what was kind of historians call the Overland Campaign, the battles of Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and then down on to Petersburg in the spring and summer of 1864. And everybody thought this was going to be definitive. It was going to end the war. It didn't at all. It caused 85,000 casualties, and it ended in the armored trenches of Petersburg with nobody going anywhere. And so you have this really interesting moment where Grant is the glorious Grant, the undefeated and undefeatable Grant, whatever, the great force from the West, is just stuck in his trenches in front of Richmond and Petersburg and going absolutely nowhere. And this is, they have this great plan. They're going to blow up, use miners to blow a hole in the lines, which doesn't work and is even a worse disaster than it was before. And it just goes on. And so there you have it, summer of 1864. Grant, whose attack on Lee was supposed to, one, win, and two, determine the election of 1864, which was only a few months away. Lincoln at that point looked like he was going to lose. A Union victory would mean that Lincoln would win. There is no Union victory. It's this kind of total disaster. And there Grant is, having not done what he was supposed to do. And there we take him in July of 1864. It's sort of a great moment. Like, okay, kind of, what do we do now?
Right.
And so I think Grant, what I write about in my Grant chapter, and I think I hope that readers don't think they've read this before, but it's that moment when all hope should be lost here. And in fact, it was. The Union had lost hope. They were at their lowest point probably in the war in the summer of 1864. Belief that they couldn't win. There was no, and if you couldn't win, then what was going to happen in the North was people were just going to say, we're tired of the blood, tired of the money that we're spending, tired of the suffering. Let's just end it. Let's make peace. And that was the Confederacy's great hope. So you have this moment, and that's the moment where I won't go, I'll stop now, but that's the moment where I say is actually probably Grant's most brilliant time of the war, when he's not actually fighting. He takes over the war in his mind across 1,000-mile front, and he breaks the power of the War Department. He does all these great things, allies himself with Lincoln, and we come out on the other end with Sherman's victory in Atlanta and Lincoln's victory at in the 1864 election.
Yeah, to me, one of the most interesting things about Grant is that, in my view at least, sort of his personality almost mirrors the way he sort of conducts this war from a high level, in that in his personal life, he was maybe a drunk. He seemed to be a miserable failure at job after job after job. He can't seem to hold anything down. He's admitting to himself and to people close to him that he's failing his family. And in the book, in one of your chapters, you say, quote, "What is missing in the conventional view is this man's extraordinary resilience through the bad times, his stubborn ability to weather harrowing and relentless adversity. Longstreet's account is only one example. What stands out in his life are less the defeats than his ability to endure them, less his perpetually declining prospects than his refusal to allow his losses to become shattering moral defeats." So I think that's a good way to sort of summarize his personality, in that a lot of these Civil War generals before him just seemed to not be able to weather the storm, so to speak. And Grant seemed to have this personal history where, yes, he was failing over and over and over again, but he was also sort of learning this duality of, yes, I'm failing, but I'm also learning how to recover. And when the Union, it seemed like they needed, obviously, as you kind of painted that picture there, things were looking bad in early 1864, and Grant sort of had that personal ability to sort of reach down and hold on to something while the times were bad, and then recover.
Yeah, well, you made a good point there, and that was that the other Union generals they lost confidence in themselves. And one of the amazing things about Grant is, even in the face of considerable evidence that he should lose confidence in himself, he didn't. He never did. And it was amazing. I mean, you look at, as you said, all the business failures, one after another, each worse than the last. He's almost 40. He's selling firewood on the corner of a street in St. Louis. This is a West Point grad. And so he never lost confidence in himself, and he never he didn't interpret defeat the way other people interpreted. And for him, it was all the way you thought about it. It wasn't the thing. It was how you think about it. And the greatest moment of it, Sherman thought it was the greatest moment in the war. And many people I think, would agree with that, or it was certainly one of the greatest moments in the war, is the Battle of the Wilderness. It's just a disaster for the Union. It's Grant's first fight against Lee, and Lee, in any numerical way you want to measure it, it's worse than Chancellorsville, which was, numerically speaking, which was Lee's greatest victory. Union just gets clobbered and enormous numbers of casualties. And all the other Union generals, after having that happen to them, let's take Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville, they just turn around and back off. The evidence in front of them suggests that they're going to be defeated and suggests the idea of defeat. So now we're in the moments after the Battle of the Wilderness is over. And all of the Union soldiers, almost to a man, are expecting to do what they called a skedaddle. They're just going to back off. They've had a terrible beating and a bad day. They're going to back off and retreat. They're sitting in camp, and they look up, and some of the men in this one brigade see these riders coming down a road, and it's a road that heads north, that heads south to Richmond and Petersburg. And they're looking up, they're going, oh, who's riding? Who would be riding toward? That's where the enemy is down there. Who's riding that way? Toward the Confederate capital. And then they look and they squint and they look and they realize that it's Grant. And the cheers that are the description of the cheers that roll through the army, because they get immediately, they're seeing the world the way Grant sees it, which is, this is not a defeat. I don't look at it that way. I look at this as the first battle in a campaign, and we're heading south. That's Grant.
Yeah. So there's, again, sort of this nuance and this duality where it's sort of this inspiring story of a man who basically turned himself around and turned around a whole country essentially by changing tactics and constantly going on the attack and not allowing Robert E. Lee to gain the offensive. And I think kind of at first glance, you look at something like that and you sort of feel that inspiring story. But on the other hand, I think you also have to think about just the people who had to be sacrificed in order for that to happen. I mean, to the average Union soldier that is being ordered to attack against some of these defenses that at this point in the war had essentially become proto World War I trench warfare. They probably wouldn't have said this is some inspiring story. I mean, you had people being just destroyed in these battles in the wilderness. There was trees on fire, people being burned alive. People being ripped apart by mini balls, just all sorts of carnage. And I think it's interesting how you sort of paint that picture of sort of this theme of the Civil War sort of turning individuals around and sort of that inspiring element of it, but also just the other side of the coin, which is the destruction of just life after life in some of these battles.
Right. You make a good point that I wish I'd used your turn of phrase, but it was the effect that Grant's self-transformation mirrors the transformation of the Army, which it does. His self, the two are the same things. So Grant, the conventionally critical view of Grant, particularly from Southern historians, was that he was just a butcher, was that he had enormous resources at his disposal, lots of men, and he just fed them into the chopper, and he didn't care. And it was just going to be, okay, you open your wrist, I'll open mine, and let's see who bleeds first. And by the way, I've got twice as many men as you do, so it's going to be you.
Right.
That view of Grant, right? And what's interesting is that there's plenty of truth to that view. That Grant was certainly able to do very intricate and elaborate war fighting and battle fighting as he did at Vicksburg. No question that that's a complex campaign. It isn't just men being fed into the slaughter. But the example that I used in the book is this one of Grant's generals, Governor Warren, who is a very smart guy, and he's an engineer, and he knows what it's like to fight against trenches, and he's ordered to attack Lee's breastworks and field works there, and he sends the men in, and they just get chopped to pieces, and then they come back. And then they get sent in, and he protests. He says, this is crazy. You can't do this. They're not assailable. you cannot take those fortifications. And then his men get sent again, and he protests again. And then they get sent a third time. And I think at some point he says he's not going to do it. And the fourth time, he's ordered to do it because he knows what's going to happen. He's going to give the order, and 5,000 men or 10,000 men are going over the hill, and they're all going to be cut to pieces. And Warren knows that. And yet he is ordered to do it by Grant. And this is, so when they say Grant the Hammerer, Grant, he's awesome, he won't give up. Yeah, but if you're Warren and the men, as you were pointing out, that's what it looks like from their point of view. They're being sacrificed callously. Now, what Grant isn't just doing that, though, for fun. Grant had a vision of how to fight Lee, and that was to keep Lee occupied at many points at any given time. Don't let him rest. Don't let him mass his troops. Hit him here, and even if you're going to sacrifice troops, you're going to keep him busy while you move and you against him in other areas and so forth. Grant had a reason for doing it, but the fact is he was willing to do it. And other Union generals, McClellan especially, absolutely not willing ever to do that with his men. It's actually one of McClellan's few plus points, or a few high points, or sympathetic parts of his nature, where he just really blanched at the idea of feeding his own men into certain slaughter. Grant was happy to do it. And that's one of the reasons the Union won, is Lincoln finally had somebody who was willing to do that.
Right. So again, it's complicated and nuanced, and it sort of depends on what perspective you want to look at things from. But regardless of whether you think of Grant as a butcher or, some sort of savior, you can't deny just the craziness that was going on these battlefields. And you have a couple chapters in the book sort of devoted to this, where you talk about Civil War medicine and sort of what that meant with just sort of these horror shows that were going on in these hospital tents. And I think at one point you mentioned, I didn't know this, but ambulances carrying men off the battlefield to some hospital somewhere, and these injured guys with these huge wounds are in these wooden wheeled wagons carried by horses, and they're bouncing up and down, and they're just ripping open wounds, and just it's disgusting in there. And maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of this medical aspect, and maybe get into Clara Barton or anything you want to there.
Well, I chose to kind of look at the Overland Campaign in a different way, I think, than most people would have. One of the ways I looked at it was as the war's kind of great unheralded medical disaster. It was a medical disaster of proportions that no one had ever seen before. And partly that was because the fighting never stopped. In the Civil War, typically, and the 7 days was an exception to this, but typically you would have a battle, maybe lasted a day or two, and then that would be it. All the tearing and cutting of flesh. And I mean, an army could only take so much of it before the stretcher men and the ambulance guys in the field hospitals that would just be overloaded. And so there would be this kind of, the battle would end, and however it ended, and then there would be this pause that was usually, a number of weeks at the very least. Army licking its wounds, tending to its wounded and its dead. And in the Overland Campaign, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and so forth, it was just constant fighting, and it overloaded all of these systems. And as you said, that particular story you were referring to was normally a Civil War ambulance had springs on it anyway, so that when you were being carted off, the springs would give you a little bit of cushion. But because they immediately ran out of them, they used the ammunition wagons, which had no springs on them at all. And so are these people inside these things just screaming, just being, because they're on extremely rutted and rocky roads, and it's, whatever bandages were on them were torn off. There were people just sort of clinging to the sides of these. And that was just one piece of it. There was a moment when 7,000 wounded men are being taken from the battlefield of the Wilderness, and they're going to be taken out to a train depot and then taken to Washington, D.C. And this seems like a really good idea. And they're all on the way on these terrible wagons bumping down the roads, but salvation lies ahead in the form of the train. But as it turns out, Grant's army is moving, that he's moving by his left. And he's now moving too far from his supply depot where the train is. So now the men, all 7,000 of them, are now ordered to get, stay in the wagons. Wagons turn around. Now they're going back 20 miles the other way toward Fredericksburg, where, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them die along the way. And it's just this, the Civil War medicine was, was very sophisticated in some ways, surgically very sophisticated, but they didn't know what a microbe was, so they didn't understand infection, and it was just this kind of horror story that unfolded, and it was, and that was again what you were talking about, the point of view of the common man. There, I'm trying to descend to the level of, okay, what does it actually feel like to be a soldier who got wounded in that campaign? Because it was grim. It was just beyond grim.
That Civil War professor, who's actually pretty notable Civil War historian, that class I took from him, I got a chance to take, he said, and I'll never forget, he said, if you were able to time travel back to a Civil War hospital tent, field tent, and if you brought with you a box of Neosporin and a box of Band-Aids, you would be viewed as the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Yes.
And I think that kind of sums it up, because it was just a horror show out there, and then once it got to the hospital, it oftentimes got worse due to just disease and sanitation and all the medical horrors that you describe in the book. But again, you sort of have this, amidst all the chaos, heroes can be born, and Clara Barton turned out to be just, I think you called her, what did you call her? The angel of the battlefield angel?
Well, the press called her angel of the battlefield.
Okay, yeah. So
what she did was she invented this kind of place for herself in the war. The war didn't want women anywhere near the front ever. Eventually Dorothea Dix and the nursing corps got closer to the front, but they didn't want them out there. And Clara Barton saw the need and became this kind of one-woman supply operation. She would load up her carriages with supplies and take off through either actual passes or fudged passes and make her way to these battle scenes where, of course, the surgeons had run out of everything, and there was Clara with all this stuff. The greatest tale of all, to me, was at Antietam, where the single bloodiest day in American history was the Battle of Antietam, and the single bloodiest couple of hours of that day were Joe Hooker fighting Stonewall Jackson in the cornfield just north of the town of Sharpsburg. And it was just, we're talking about the most vicious fighting of the entire Civil War. Clara Barton manages to get in there. She's the only woman within miles of the place. She gets in there with her supplies, finds this field hospital that's literally at the edge of the cornfield. So bullets are whizzing through it, and shrapnel and things are whizzing through here. She sort of sets up shop. They've run out of everything. They're using corn husks to bandage the men. Clara Barton has, like she didn't have Neosporin, but she had bandages, and she had all sorts of everything that a normal field surgeon would want. They can't believe it. So she sets up shop there, and then she herself, because there's not enough surgeons, she herself starts to do surgery. She takes a bullet out of somebody's cheek, and at one point she's cradling a man's head in her arms, and she feels a little fluttering on the side of her dress, and he gets blown away by a piece of shrapnel. It's just this extraordinary act of heroism. And while she's doing this, she's being, as the battle progresses and the day progresses, she's increasingly deferred to by everybody there, who kind of take orders from her as they would from an officer. And then when darkness came, and of course the darkness was the problem because they had no way how are they going to operate in the darkness? Lo and behold, Clara has brought a whole set of lanterns that they could operate by at nighttime. So as she became this one woman, she single-handedly supplied a field hospital that treated 1,500 men all by herself.
That's crazy. So
you have this kind of astounding woman who's out there doing these things. And she played a big role also in the battle I was talking about. But yeah, right. It's just absolutely extraordinary hero. There aren't that many. You always want to find women in the Civil War. There were plenty on the front, on the home fronts, but there aren't any out there in the battlefields because men didn't allow them out there. And she was, I guess, a favorite discovery of mine in this book.
You do have these stories like Clara Barton and maybe some others where you get this sort of heroic element to it, and it's really hard to, with some of these, you can always find kind of these ways to nitpick, but with a person like Clara Barton, it's really hard to. It just seems like all great things she was accomplishing. But as she was accomplishing those things, the war was really turning. You have a note about this. You say you don't like the term total war, but it sort of feels that way with the way that Sheridan was conducting some things in the Shenandoah Valley, and obviously how Sherman was, doing his march to the sea, and it became something where civilians were becoming more involved as far as being the victims, and a lot of times this was at the fault of someone like Sherman or the Union Army sort of going through the South. Let me just quote one thing that you have Sherman saying here. He says, quote, "No man will deny that the United States would be benefited by dispossessing a single prejudiced, hard-headed, and disloyal planter and substitute in his place a dozen or more patient, industrious, good families, even if they be of foreign birth." And then he also says, "But now it is too late. All the mowers of earth cannot restore them to their slaves any more than their dead grandfathers. Next year their lands will be taken, for in war we can take them, and rightfully too. And in another year they may beg in vain for their lives." So
yeah, he was real popular in the South, you might imagine.
Right. So you have essentially Sherman, I don't want to say resorting, but he's exercising just biblical justice here, where he's not afraid to take land, burn food,
exile
people. He's talking about population replacement there, which is crazy.
One of his favorite ideas was population replacement.
Yeah. So,
well, the thing about it was that just to clarify total war, the reason I don't like it is because from where we sit in the 20th century, I would understand total war, let's say in terms of the firebombing of innocent civilians in Dresden, or particularly Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is total warfare. In other words, we were killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians deliberately. That did not happen in the Civil War. Was their property destroyed? Yes. Were they exiled and depopulated? Cities depopulated? Yes, they were. But there was never a war. There were guerrilla wars, informal wars against civilians, but not official wars the way there were in the 20th century. And the only reason I object to total war is not because what Sherman did was extreme. It was, but I just think people tend to think of that as, dropping an atomic bomb or firebombing Dresden. Where you're deliberately killing civilians, which there were never orders given to that effect, and in fact it rarely happened.
Right.
So civilians being randomly slaughtered by Union soldiers, that simply did not happen.
Yeah. So you don't want to make a false equivalency, but on the other hand, do you think that this sort of behavior by the Union Army at certain points towards the end of the war, do you think that this contributes in the modern day to sort of this idea of this lost cause where, again, or this idea of like Northern aggression, or this idea where I've had conversations with real people who are, have been affected by the actions of people like Sheridan and Sherman, and obviously the emotions, and, obviously not in the modern day, but their families from generations before, and the emotions are still hot. And I think it sort of clouds people's ability to sort of look at things from different perspectives.
Yeah, there's no way you're going to bridge that gap. If Sheridan and his men burned the whole dang Shenandoah Valley, they didn't leave a chicken or an egg or a fence post or a cow or a barn or a bale of hay. Nothing, no crop, no nothing. They burned it to the ground. They burned a number of houses down too, although not as many as people thought. But yeah, so you can't square that. You can't. For the residents of the Shenandoah Valley who come out of that with all of their male, let's say their brother and their father and their sons dead, and every single thing that they have gone. This is something that was remembered for generations and generations and generations. I grew up in Connecticut. The war touched us, but only because of relatives who were injured or killed in the fighting. the South was destroyed. I mean, well, not the whole thing, but I mean, big pieces of it were, and you can never square it. And you're never going to explain to anybody, from Central Georgia that Sherman was right to do what he did, or that he didn't, or South Carolina, even worse. I mean, you can't square it. And it's two different points of view. It still is today. I think the interesting thing about Sherman, unlike everybody else in the North, Sherman felt he absolutely had to explain and justify morally and practically and morally in every other single way what he had done. And this is what fascinates me about Sherman. He just spent so much time trying to explain to the Southerners why he's doing this to them. There's just no one like him in the war, and no one in Washington cared to do that. They didn't care about explaining anything to anybody. Sherman felt the need and did, and just spent enormous amounts of time trying to, at some point, a woman comes to him in Columbia, South Carolina, and she says, "Why did you just burn our city down?" He says, "I didn't burn your city down." He said, the fire was struck the moment that your father and whatever seceded and started this war at Fort Sumter. And he said, it's now just touching you. Those flames are now just touching you. So it just goes on. Anyway, I'm not trying to be an arbiter here and saying that Sherman is great and the South is wrong. I mean, I don't take sides, but you can't square it. That'll never be squared. Or you can't, although you can win some money in a bar by asking who was the founding president of LSU. That's always a good way to earn money in a bar.
Yeah. Well, I'm mindful of your time here. Maybe if you're willing, I think it might be important to go over the election of 1864 and sort of how, in many ways, the Civil War was decided in this election, not necessarily on the battlefield.
Yeah, I do think so. And as I say in the book, that what the war is about in its final year is only one thing. Forget about slavery, forget about every other thing. It's great. The clarity is so wonderful. It's about one thing, and everybody sees it that way. It's about that election. And if you're the South, getting rid of Lincoln, because if Lincoln loses, it's going to be a Democrat, and there's going to be enormous pressure on him to make peace, however the peace is made, whether it's the Union back together with slavery intact or two separate nations with slavery intact. But, that's what's going to happen. And from the Northern point of view, the Northern point of view was exactly the same. The expectations were the same, that a Lincoln victory meant the war would be pursued to its end, and an end that many people thought was in sight, and that a loss would create peace. And who knows what happens after, if that's true. It's all hypothetical, but to me, let's say McClellan won, and let's say that he arranged a peace of some kind. They would have to fight that war eventually. So that was not going to stand. Slavery wasn't going to stand into the 20th century. So a war would have to be fought, but it was everything. It was great clarity. And so you have this moment in August of 1864 where everybody thinks Lincoln is going to lose. His own party is convinced of it. He's convinced of it. Everybody's convinced of it, and it's kind of over. And then this amazing thing happens on September 2nd. Atlanta falls. Sherman takes Atlanta, and everything changes. Incredible. In a war where it's hard to get, as you say, it's all nuance, and it's hard to, it's such clarity. That it was all about that election, and Sherman taking Atlanta pretty much settled it. Just days after the Democratic Convention had been railing about Lincoln's mismanagement of the war and how they could never win, boom, Atlanta's gone. Lincoln wins. It's great clarity.
Right.
I think.
One of the strangely comforting things while reading about the election of 1864 is I couldn't help but think of the modern day parallels, where you sort of have these politicians just lying out of their teeth, and you have a press that's going crazy with sensationalist, headlines and stories, and the dysfunction in Washington was just crazy at this time. And obviously they were in the middle of a civil war, so it's always comforting to know that the dysfunction of the modern day could be worse.
Yeah, it's true. We can feel better. It's true to some extent. My feeling is that our country's always been deeply divided. It was when I was growing up in the 60s. It is now. It was even in revolutionary times. But the Civil War proves that as bad as we can be, somehow we muddle through. And so look at our present times. Our present times aren't that dire. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. And I'll get you out of here on this one, maybe just one more.
Okay.
It's kind of a broad one, and you can kind of go any avenue you want. But after writing a book like this, sort of about the end of the Civil War, what do you view as sort of the legacy of the Civil War, like kind of connecting to that idea of the modern day parallels? And maybe this could be about the role of the media, or, I know you had a career as a journalist. Is there anything you see from that time period that you could sort of apply to today, where, we sort of have obviously a host of problems that we're dealing with, whether it be, social media or the role of journalism, or questions about the, veracity of pretty much anything certain politicians say. What are the modern day parallels that you might see after writing a book like this?
So the parallels, the parallels in the situations are just everywhere. As you were just saying, people, there's just untruth all over the place, especially in the media. The media is just delivering like untruth on both sides, Confederate and Union, by the bucketful. It's hard to get at what the central truth is. It's hard to get anybody to agree, as my father would say, that it's Tuesday. They can't. There's almost a hysterical level of, feeling on both sides that, can you believe these godless, immoral people on the other side? Does that not describe today? That describes the Civil War. So the parallels are just all over the place. We're a country of extremes. In a lot of ways, the extremes sort of mirror each other. If you look at regionally anyway, and there's some regional overlap here, red state, blue state, and so forth. I always liked the fact that I always thought that the two most radical states in the Civil War were Massachusetts and South Carolina, radically, opposed.
Right.
And I think you could really make that argument today. I'm pretty sure it's probably Massachusetts and South Carolina.
Right.
But as for what it means, I can't come up with any meaning other than the one I suggested a few minutes ago, which was just that I think we live in a country that is deeply divided. I think it's unrealistic to expect that we're not. Every once in a while we come together for something like World War II, but we're more likely to be split the way we were in the sectional conflict in the years of the Vietnam War. I think we're more likely to be split. And democracy is messy. We have a messy republic. It's a messy way to do things, but it is better than the alternatives, I think. And I don't know, the only legacy is that's as bad as it's ever been. 750,000 people being died and a whole country being destroyed. And somehow we muddled through. So I don't know. I guess my maybe not a legacy, but a lesson I take from it is that in some very dark way, that's good news. We got through that as a country. We came out the other side, actually, in some ways, stronger. And so maybe that's the message, that, if you think we live in a country that's usually all happy, hunky-dory, we're all for one and one for all, that isn't true. It can be masked by things like a world war, but we're not. We have great differences. And when I look at the 60s when I grew up, the number of race riots in the cities, the riot at the Democratic Convention in 68, this is the way we are, I think. And I think the question becomes is how you get through it.
Yeah.
And many people would now say, and I'm not taking sides one or the other, many people on the Democrat side would say, the way to get through it is we need to get rid of this president. That would be their way of saying it. And the people on the other side would say the reverse, that what we need to do is follow the policies of this president to make the country great again. But either way, it's amazing to just see the depth of the divide. And so every moment pretty much I was researching this book, I'm sitting there going, wow, it just rings. It rings in my own time. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's just amazing how, I never used to be that interested in the Civil War, but sort of the older I get and the more I learn about it, there's just modern day parallel after modern day parallel, and it's kind of eerie. And I feel like sort of the questions that came out of the Civil War and the questions about how to rebuild, are we even rebuilding, or are we starting something new? And sort of the themes of the Civil War have sort of, and of course slavery and racism and that whole legacy. To me, that understanding modern day America, the more I think about it and the more I read about it, it seems to be all about understanding the Civil War first and foremost. And that's just
I think
my
it's true
opinion.
on some level, though. It's hard. It's hard. It's, as you say, it's nuanced. It's hard to put your finger on. But you know, we had this great problem of slavery back then. We still have this great problem of racism. It's just all over the newspapers every day. I pick one up. It's just racism. This racism. The race question hasn't been solved. You know, it's different than it was. There's no more slavery, but it's we haven't solved it, and you could even argue that we haven't even come close to solving it.
Right. You know, I hate to end on that one, but
Yeah, right. So,
that's a whole...
moments before I was saying it's a sign that we can muddle through, so we could end on that one.
Right. Yeah. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to come on. I do appreciate it. The book is called Hymns of the Republic. S.C. Gwynne. Do you have anything to plug? Anything you want to?
No, it's out. Its official publication date is October 29th, so it should be out there pretty soon, if not now already. But it's just out right as we speak.
Yep, and I've read through it. I think it's great. So if you're a fan of this podcast, I think it'd be definitely a good choice for you. So Sam, thanks for coming on.
All right, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for the provocative and interesting questions.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. I tried to keep it sort of true to the style of what I would normally do on the podcast. I know some people don't love interviews and conversations like that, and that's fine. And if you're wondering what's happening with the Bosnian War series, it will still be out probably next week at its normally scheduled time. So the reality is that as the podcast sort of expands and gets more notoriety, new opportunities come up, and I had an opportunity to talk with Sam there and felt like it would be a useful conversation. So I think I might do that sort of thing every once in a while. I kind of view it as sort of a bonus. It won't really affect what I'm normally doing in kind of the normal course of the normal podcast. So if you want to listen to that type of stuff, you can. If you don't, that's fine too. And you can just wait until the normally scheduled podcast comes out. So just wanted to give you the heads up. I'm trying to do new things, trying to grow, trying to go onto some new avenues. I don't think it'll happen a lot, but you might see this type of conversation happening from time to time. I know the sound quality probably wasn't the best on this one. I'm still sort of learning the best way to do this type of thing. I hope you'll bear with me there. There's no sound engineers or anything like that. So everything from the researching to the writing to the recording, even the annoying intro and outro musical jingle is all me. So as always, let me know what you think. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and thanks for the support.